Before we dive into the story, write down where you're watching from in the comments. Let's go. The police car stopped traffic, not because of an emergency, not because of sirens or flashing lights. It stopped because the chief of police opened her door, stepped onto the street, and walked toward a little girl sweeping the sidewalk as if she belonged there. People slowed, drivers leaned forward. A couple across the street paused mid-conversation. No one understood why. Chief Eleanor Brooks, a woman known for her strict posture and quiet authority, would leave her car for a child everyone had learned to overlook. The girl didn't look up right away. She was small for her age, thin in a way that suggested she'd learned to take up as little space as possible. Her clothes were clean but worn soft by too many washes. A broom almost as tall as she was rested against her shoulder while dust gathered neatly into a pile at her feet. Her name was Lillian Harper. Around the neighborhood, people thought they knew her. She was the quiet one, the helpful one, the child who never caused trouble. Poor thing, some would say before walking past without stopping. Eleanor had driven this street hundreds of times. She knew the houses, the corners, the shortcuts. She couldn't remember when the girl had first appeared there, only that she always seemed to be in the same spot, waiting, working, watching adults hurry by. This time, Eleanor didn't stay in the car. She crossed the street slowly, ignoring the impatient honk behind her. Then, without a word, she lowered herself until one knee touched the pavement. At eye level, the sound of the broom stopped. Lillian finally looked up. Her eyes weren't frightened. That was what struck Eleanor most. They were calm, alert, as if the girl had already learned that reacting too strongly only made things harder. "You don't have to stop," Eleanor said gently, surprising herself with how soft her voice sounded. Lillian nodded once, then rested the broom against the curb. She waited, not expectantly, just patiently. "How long have you been helping out here?" Eleanor asked. Lillian shrugged. "A while." It wasn't evasive, it was practiced. Eleanor glanced at the house behind her. Curtains drawn, door closed. No sign that anyone had noticed the police car, the gathering stairs, or the unusual sight of a chief kneeling in the street. "What's your name?" Eleanor asked. "Lillian." "And how old are you, Lillian?" 10, she said, after the smallest pause. 10. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not anger, recognition. The kind that came too late and all at once. "You waiting for someone?" Eleanor asked. Lillian shook her head. "No, ma'am." She said it the way someone says the truth when they've learned not to explain it. Cars began moving again as Eleanor stood. The moment was already dissolving, slipping back into the ordinary. That's how these things usually went. A glance, a thought, a promise to remember later. Eleanor didn't get back into her car. She looked down at Lillian one last time and made a decision she couldn't yet name, only feel. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said. Lillian didn't smile. She didn't ask why. She only nodded, as if adults making promises was something she'd learned to accept without expecting them to last. As Eleanor drove away, one thought stayed with her, steady and unsettling. Something about that little girl felt normal, and somehow that was what felt most wrong. Chief Eleanor Brooks told herself she had imagined the weight of that moment. By the time she reached the station, the street already felt distant, folded back into the long list of places she passed every day without stopping. Children helped their families all the time, quiet ones especially. There was nothing unusual about a girl with a broom. Nothing that required a chief of police to step outside protocol. That was what Eleanor repeated, as she set her keys on the desk and began her morning briefing. Yet her attention drifted, faces blurred, words landed and slid away. Every few minutes, an image returned uninvited. A small pile of dust on the curb. A broom leaned just right. A girl who didn't ask questions because she had learned not to. After the meeting, Eleanor found herself standing at the filing cabinets without remembering how she got there. She closed the drawer again. "No," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "You don't go looking for problems that aren't yours." Still. At lunch, she drove past the street. Lillian was there again. Same spot, same broom, same quiet focus, as if the sidewalk depended on her alone. Eleanor didn't stop this time. She slowed just enough to be certain it wasn't coincidence. That afternoon, Eleanor visited Howard Mills, a former social services coordinator who now volunteered at a community center near the river. If anyone could calm her unease, it would be him. Howard had spent decades in rooms full of paperwork and unanswered questions. He understood how easily concern could turn into overreaction. Howard listened without interrupting as Eleanor described the girl. The broom, the feeling she couldn't quite explain. When she finished, he didn't smile. "Do you know what the easiest cases are to miss?" he asked. Eleanor folded her arms. "The complicated ones." Howard shook his head. "The quiet ones. The ones that don't make noise. No complaints, no calls, no scenes." "That doesn't mean something's wrong," Eleanor said, though the words sounded thinner than she intended. Howard leaned back in his chair. "It doesn't mean something's right either." Silence settled between them. "You're not talking about intervening," Howard continued. "You're talking about noticing. There's a difference." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She kept seeing files stacked neatly, each one closed because no one had asked the right question at the right time. At 2 a.m, she opened her laptop and logged into the internal record system. She didn't type Lillian's name at first. Instead, she searched the address. The Harper residence appeared with a short history. Routine visits. School enrollment confirmations. Notes that ended in phrases like, "No further action required." It all looked acceptable, proper, finished. Then Eleanor noticed something small. A line that mentioned follow-up visits. Plural. She clicked deeper. One visit completed, another scheduled. The next marked as pending. And after that, nothing. No explanation, no closure, just silence where answers should have been. Eleanor closed the laptop and sat back. This was the moment she still could have stepped away. Told herself that unfinished paperwork was not her responsibility, that the system worked because it had to. Instead, she picked up her phone and set a reminder for the morning. Not to act, just to watch. As she turned off the light, one thought followed her into the dark, steady and persistent. If no one ever crossed the line before, what would happen if she did now? Eleanor Brooks chose not to announce herself. The next afternoon, she parked a block away from Lillian Street and walked the rest of the distance. Her coat pulled low, her badge tucked out of sight. For once, she wasn't there as chief of police. She was simply someone paying attention. Lillian was already sweeping. The rhythm was steady, careful, not rushed, not distracted. Each small movement suggested practice, the kind that comes from doing the same thing day after day without being told. Eleanor stopped at a corner cafe across the street and watched through the window. People passed Lillian without slowing. A man nodded politely. A woman dropped a coin into a jar without meeting her eyes. No one spoke to her for more than a second. It was as if the neighborhood had agreed, without discussion, that the girl required no questions. When Lillian finished one stretch of sidewalk, she gathered her things and sat on the curb. She didn't pull out a phone or a book. She simply waited. Eleanor crossed the street. "Busy day?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. Lillian looked up and nodded. "Yes." "Ma'am? School let out early?" "Yes, ma'am." Short answers, clear, final. Eleanor walked beside her for a few steps. "Do you like school?" Lillian thought for a moment. "It's fine." "Just fine?" "I like reading," Lillian added, as if offering something extra. Eleanor smiled. "What are you reading right now?" "History," Lillian said. "Old stories." That answer stayed with Eleanor long after she thanked her and walked away. Later that afternoon, Eleanor visited the elementary school 2 streets over. She didn't introduce herself as part of an investigation. There was none. She spoke with the office staff as if she were simply passing through. Lillian Harper's name was familiar. "She's very polite," the secretary said. "Never late, never disruptive." The teacher echoed it. "She does her work, helps other students. She's easy." Easy. Eleanor asked gently, Has she ever asked for help? The teacher paused. Not really, she manages. And when she doesn't? Another pause. Longer this time. Well, the teacher said carefully, she never complains. That evening, Eleanor walked the neighborhood again. She spoke to shop owners, to neighbors standing on their porches. Everyone had a version of Lillian. She's mature for her age. She keeps to herself. She's always been like that. No one mentioned worry. No one mentioned concern. It felt strangely like a small victory, proof that Lillian wasn't invisible, that people had noticed her. And yet, as Eleanor turned the corner, she spotted Lillian heading home, her broom over her shoulder. The house swallowed her quickly, door closing behind her without ceremony. Eleanor stood across the street for a long moment. On paper, everything looked acceptable. School attendance, community familiarity, no alarms, no raised voices, no reason for intervention. But one detail refused to settle. Later that night, Eleanor opened the school health records she had permission to view. Routine screenings were listed: vision, hearing, growth assessments. Several were marked as postponed. One note read, "Student appeared tired. Will reschedule." Rescheduled when? There was no date. Eleanor closed the file slowly. For the first time since that day on the sidewalk, a clear thought formed, not a feeling. Not an unease, but a question that demanded an answer. What happens to a child who never complains, when something is quietly being missed? Eleanor Brooks began to understand that some problems didn't announce themselves. They didn't arrive with raised voices or urgent calls. They settled quietly, wrapped in routines that looked responsible from the outside. That realization stayed with her as she returned to Lillian's street the following afternoon. The girl was sitting on the curb again, broom beside her, watching leaves roll along the pavement. "You finished early today," Eleanor said. Lillian nodded. There wasn't much dust. Eleanor sat on the edge of the sidewalk, not too close, not too far. She had learned that space mattered. "Do you ever get tired?" she asked, keeping her voice light. Lillian hesitated. "Just a moment." "Everyone gets tired." "Of course," Eleanor said. "I mean, more than usual." Lillian looked at her hands. "I'm used to it." Used to it. Eleanor felt the words settle heavily between them. She waited, letting silence do what questions sometimes couldn't. "Does school feel harder on some days?" Eleanor asked. Lillian shrugged. "I just go slower." "That helps?" "It makes it easier for other people," Lillian replied. Eleanor didn't ask who those people were. That evening, she returned to the station and pulled archived records, documents no one had looked at in years. Most were routine, predictable. Then she found a report from a community health visit scheduled when Lillian was younger. The visit had been marked as completed. But the notes were thin, too thin. Child appeared quiet, no concerns expressed, no measurements recorded, no follow-up instructions, no second page. Eleanor leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She had signed off on hundreds of summaries like this over the years. Trusted that what wasn't flagged didn't need her attention. Trusted that silence meant stability. The next day, Eleanor visited the local clinic. The nurse at the front desk recognized the name immediately. "Oh yes, Lillian. Sweet girl." "When was the last full checkup?" Eleanor asked. The nurse clicked through the system. Her brow furrowed. "It looks like some appointments were missed." "Missed by who?" The nurse hesitated. "They were marked as postponed. No follow-up confirmation." Eleanor thanked her and stepped outside into the late afternoon sun. The street buzzed with normal life. Cars, laughter, open doors. Everything looked exactly the way it should. And yet, she felt a shift inside her. This wasn't about one missed appointment, or one quiet child. It was about how easily small omissions stacked on top of one another, forming something much larger without anyone noticing. Later that week, Eleanor found herself standing across from Lillian again. "You know," Eleanor said gently, "if something feels hard, it's okay to say so." Lillian considered that. "I don't want to make mistakes." "Mistakes?" "Yes," Lillian said, People get tired of fixing them. The words were simple, careful. They landed harder than Eleanor expected. As Eleanor drove away that evening, one thought followed her home, refusing to loosen its grip. This wasn't a single oversight. It was a pattern, and patterns once seen couldn't be unseen. Eleanor Brooks believed that once a problem had a shape, it could be handled. She thought that understanding the pattern would lead naturally to a solution. A call made, a form completed, a door opened where one had been closed before. Didn't work that way. The first meeting was brief and orderly. Eleanor sat across from a case coordinator in a small office that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Files were stacked neatly on the desk between them, each one representing a situation that had already been reviewed and resolved. "From what we can see," the coordinator said, scanning the screen, "there are no immediate concerns." Eleanor kept her voice steady. Some appointments were postponed and never rescheduled. "That happens," the coordinator replied. "Families manage things differently. If no concerns are reported, we proceed carefully." "Carefully," Eleanor repeated. "Yes, we don't want to create issues where there aren't any." The words were polite, reasonable, and they closed the conversation. Eleanor left the office with a familiar, unsettling feeling, the sense that she had reached the edge of what rules allowed. Beyond that line, there was no clear path forward. That afternoon, she found Lillian sitting on the steps of the library, a book open on her lap. "You like it here?" Eleanor asked. Lillian nodded. "It's quiet." "Quiet can be good," Eleanor said, then added, "but it shouldn't be the only option." Lillian glanced up, uncertain. "I don't mind." Eleanor sat beside her. "Sometimes grown-ups don't see what's right in front of them," she said carefully. "That doesn't mean it's your job to make things easier for us." Lillian closed the book slowly. "If I say I'm tired," she asked, "will that make things worse?" The question was soft, earnest, and it stopped Eleanor cold. "No," Eleanor said after a moment. "It shouldn't." Lillian looked down again. "It usually does." That evening, Eleanor reviewed everything once more. She looked for errors, for missed steps, for something concrete she could point to and fix. What she found instead was balance. Everything evenly weighted just enough to stay in place. No one had pushed too hard. No one had stopped entirely. The system hadn't failed loudly, it had worked quietly. The next morning, Eleanor stood in her office, staring at the phone. She could make another call, schedule another meeting, press harder. But she knew the truth now. Good intentions weren't enough. Correct procedures weren't protection. There was no simple form that could solve what had been allowed to continue. As she drove past Lillian's street later that day, she saw the girl sweeping again, steady and careful as ever. Eleanor slowed the car, her hands tight on the wheel. For the first time, she understood that wanting to help was not the same as being able to help. And that realization, that test, left her with a single, unsettling thought she couldn't ignore. If the system said everything was fine, what did it mean when it clearly wasn't? Eleanor Brooks stopped trying to fix the situation all at once. She had learned, painfully, that pushing too hard only made doors close faster. So instead of more meetings and formal requests, she chose something quieter, something slower. She showed up, not as a uniform, not as an authority, just as a familiar face. Some days she passed Lillian on the street and only waved. Other days she stopped for a brief word, never asking questions that felt heavy. Over time, the girl began to speak without being prompted, filling the small spaces with observations about books, weather, and people she noticed but never judged. One afternoon, Eleanor brought 2 cups of hot chocolate from a nearby cafe and sat on the library steps. "I wasn't sure if you liked marshmallows," Eleanor said. Lillian considered the cup, then nodded once. "Thank you." They sat in silence, sipping slowly. "You're very observant," Eleanor said after a while. "You notice things most people miss." Lillian looked puzzled. "Like what?" "Like when someone needs space," Eleanor replied. "Or when they're pretending not to be tired." Lillian's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. "I don't pretend," she said. "I just don't talk about it." Eleanor didn't correct her. She understood now that this wasn't avoidance. It was adaptation. As days passed, Eleanor noticed changes, not dramatic ones, but meaningful. Lillian lingered longer at the library. She asked questions about books she didn't understand. Once she laughed. The sound was brief, almost surprised, as if she hadn't expected it from herself. Eleanor began to see something else too. Strength. Not the loud kind people praised, but the quiet endurance built from years of managing without being asked. Lillian remembered schedules. She planned her time carefully. She thought ahead in ways most children didn't have to. "You've learned to take care of things," Eleanor said gently one afternoon. Lillian nodded. Someone has to. That night, Eleanor sat alone at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. She thought about her own childhood, about how early she'd learned to rely on rules, on structure, on doing everything the right way because no one was coming to check. She realized then why Lillian felt familiar. They were separated by decades, but shaped by something similar. The next step came quietly. Eleanor arranged to accompany Lillian to a routine appointment, not as a demand, not as an investigation, but as support. No pressure, no urgency, just presence. When Eleanor mentioned it, Lillian hesitated. "Do I have to?" "No," Eleanor said quickly. "Only if you want to." Lillian studied her for a long moment. "Will you stay the whole time?" "Yes," Eleanor said, "if you'd like." Lillian nodded. That night, Eleanor felt something shift, not in the system, not yet, but in herself. She wasn't trying to force a solution anymore. She was building one, and for the first time since that day on the sidewalk, she allowed herself a careful, hopeful thought. Maybe change didn't start with rules or forms. Maybe it started with staying. Eleanor Brooks had spent most of her career believing that problems had faces. A person, a decision, a clear moment where someone chose wrong instead of right. This time there was no such comfort. The morning after, she agreed to accompany Lillian to the appointment. Eleanor arrived early at the station. The building was quiet, humming softly with machines warming up for the day. She sat at her desk and pulled open an old digital archive she hadn't accessed in years. She searched by date, then by location, then by signature. Her own name appeared on the screen. Not once, not twice, several times, attached to summaries, approvals, routine confirmations, each one brief, each one processed exactly as it was meant to be. Eleanor leaned back slowly, the chair creaking beneath her. She didn't remember these files. They hadn't stood out. They hadn't needed to. Everything in them had looked complete, acceptable, finished. That was when it became clear. There was no single person responsible, no loud mistake, no moment of obvious failure. The antagonist was the system itself, carefully designed to move forward without stopping, built to trust silence as proof that everything was fine. Later that afternoon, Eleanor met with a longtime colleague, Deputy Mark Sullivan, someone who knew her well enough to recognize when something was wrong. "You look like you've been up all night," he said. "I was," Eleanor replied, looking at old work. Mark raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous habit." "I signed off on things I didn't fully see," Eleanor said quietly. "That's how the job works," Mark said. "You can't question every detail." Eleanor nodded. She'd said those words herself more times than she could count. "That's the problem," she replied. That evening she walked past Lillian's street again. The girl wasn't sweeping this time. She was sitting on the steps, her backpack beside her, watching the sky shift colors as the sun dipped lower. "You look tired," Eleanor said. Lillian smiled faintly. "I'm okay." The answer came automatically. Eleanor sat beside her. "Did you know," she asked, "that sometimes adults miss things not because they don't care, but because everything looks finished?" Lillian tilted her head. "Finished means done." "Sometimes," Eleanor said. "Sometimes it just means no one asked another question." Lillian considered that. Questions can make people uncomfortable. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "They can." As Eleanor drove home later, the truth settled in fully. She hadn't been standing outside the problem all these years. She had been part of it. The realization didn't come with panic or anger. It came with something heavier, responsibility. Because now that she saw it, now that the shape of the real antagonist was clear, she couldn't pretend it didn't exist. And for the first time, Eleanor understood that the hardest battles weren't fought against people at all. They were fought against the things that worked too smoothly to be questioned. The library became their quiet agreement. No schedules were announced. No promises were made out loud. Eleanor simply showed up some afternoons, and Lillian was often there already, tucked into the same corner table near the window. A stack of books arranged with careful precision. It was a place where no one asked why you stayed so long. One rainy day, Eleanor arrived to find Lillian staring out at the blurred street, her book closed but untouched. "You're early," Eleanor said. Lillian nodded. "It's loud at home today." Eleanor didn't ask what that meant. She had learned that pressing for details only made the silence thicker. They sat together, the soft sound of pages turning and rain tapping against the glass filling the space between them. After a while, Eleanor spoke. "Did you always like coming here?" Lillian shrugged. "It's easier to think." "About what?" "About later." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I used to do that too. I planned everything far ahead. Thought if I was prepared enough, nothing could surprise me." "Did it work?" Lillian asked. Eleanor paused. "Not the way I expected." Lillian considered that, then asked quietly, "Did you ever feel like you had to grow up fast?" The question landed gently, but it stayed. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I did." That seemed to settle something between them. Lillian shifted in her chair. "I don't remember a time when people asked me what I needed," she said. "They usually just told me what was okay." Eleanor kept her eyes on the table. "And what did you learn from that?" "That if you don't ask for much," Lillian replied, "no one tells you no." Eleanor felt the weight of the words long after they were spoken. Later, as the library lights flickered on, Eleanor shared something she hadn't planned to. "When I was younger," she said, "I thought being strong meant handling everything alone. It took me a long time to realize that strength can also mean letting someone stay." Lillian looked up. "Stay?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Not fix, not rush, just stay." They walked out together as the rain eased into a fine mist. At the door, Lillian hesitated. "Do you think," she asked, choosing her words carefully, "that things can change even if they've been the same for a long time?" Eleanor met her gaze. "I think change doesn't always come all at once. Sometimes it starts with one small difference." Lillian nodded slowly. As Eleanor watched her walk down the street, backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulder, she felt something close to relief. Fragile, but real. This place, this quiet routine, had become more than a pause. It was a shelter, and as Eleanor turned toward her car, one thought followed her with gentle insistence. If a child learns early that asking is dangerous, then learning it's safe might take time. Time she was finally willing to give. The letter arrived without ceremony. Eleanor found it waiting on her desk one quiet morning, folded neatly, stamped and signed, its language polite and final. She read it once, then again, hoping she had misunderstood. Case reviewed, no further monitoring required. That was all. No explanation, no invitation to discuss, just a conclusion delivered as fact. Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest, sharper this time. She had followed every proper channel, chosen patience over pressure, presence over force. And still, the decision had been made somewhere far from the sidewalk, the library, the quiet conversations that never fit neatly into a form. She drove to the library that afternoon, the letter folded in her coat pocket. Lillian was there as usual, her book open, her posture careful. She looked up when Eleanor approached, searching her face for cues. "They said everything's fine," Eleanor said gently, choosing each word. "They're closing the file." Lillian blinked. "So, that's good," Eleanor hesitated. "It means they won't be checking in anymore." "Oh," Lillian said. The word was small, flat. I didn't mean to cause trouble, Lillian added quickly. I can stop coming here if it's a problem. No, Eleanor said at once, you didn't cause anything. But Lillian was already pulling back, her shoulders tightening, her gaze dropping to the page in front of her. I should go, she said. I have things to do. She packed her bag with practiced speed and left without looking back. Days passed. The library corner stayed empty. Eleanor drove by the street where Lillian used to sweep. The curb was clean. Too clean. No broom in sight. No small figure waiting patiently. She called the clinic. Appointments had been canceled. No reason given. When Eleanor asked if she could check in, the answer was careful and distant. The case has been resolved. Resolved. At night, Eleanor replayed every conversation. Every pause, wondering what she could have said differently. She had believed that staying was enough. She was wrong. One evening, as she walked past the library, Eleanor noticed something she hadn't before. A flyer on the community board, handwritten and crooked. Volunteers needed. Beneath it, in smaller letters, quiet work. No experience required. Eleanor stared at it longer than she meant to. This wasn't just about one decision. It was about how quickly care could be withdrawn once it stopped being official. How easily connection could be mistaken for interference. How a child could learn all over again. That reaching out led to disappearance. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was the return of silence. As Eleanor turned away, a thought settled heavily in her mind, impossible to ignore. If the system decided this story was finished, why did it feel like the most important part had just been erased? Time did what it always did. It moved forward without asking if anything had been resolved. Seasons changed. Eleanor Brooks remained in her position, steady and reliable, handling new cases, new names, new streets. From the outside, nothing about her life suggested interruption. But certain moments never fully settled. They waited. Lillian Harper was one of them. Eleanor never saw her on the sidewalk again. The broom disappeared. The quiet routine ended so completely it felt as if it had never existed at all. When Eleanor drove past the old street, she told herself that absence didn't always mean something was wrong. Still, she looked. Years later, on an ordinary afternoon, Eleanor stopped at a neighborhood pharmacy after work. The place was busy, filled with small sounds, cartwheels, quiet conversations, the hum of fluorescent lights. She was standing in line when she noticed a familiar stillness a few steps ahead. A young woman stood near the counter. Her posture composed, her movements careful and economical. She waited without shifting her weight, hands folded loosely, eyes focused on a spot just past the cashier. Something about the way she held herself caught Eleanor's attention. The young woman turned slightly. Eleanor's breath caught. Lillian. Not the child she remembered, but undeniably her. Taller now. Older. The same thoughtful eyes, carrying more weight than years alone could explain. Eleanor didn't speak right away. She watched as Lillian completed her purchase, thanked the clerk, and stepped aside. Lillian, Eleanor said softly. The young woman turned. Recognition flickered, cautious and restrained. Chief Brooks, she said. Her voice was calm, polite. I didn't expect to see you here, Eleanor replied. Lillian nodded. I moved back recently, just for a while. They stood there, the space between them filled with everything that hadn't been said. You look well, Eleanor offered. I manage, Lillian said. The words echoed something from long ago. They walked outside together. The late afternoon air was warm. The sky stretched wide and blue above them. I meant to check in, Eleanor said. More than once. I know, Lillian replied. Things got quiet. Yes, Eleanor said. They did. Lillian hesitated, then added, I learned how to handle things on my own. Eleanor nodded, though the statement tightened something in her chest. Before they parted, Eleanor asked, Would you like to talk sometime? Just to catch up. Lillian considered the question carefully. Maybe, she said. I'll think about it. That night, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table long after dark, the house silent around her. Seeing Lillian again hadn't brought closure. It had brought clarity. The past wasn't finished simply because time had passed. Certain questions had only been postponed, not answered. And whatever Lillian carried now had been shaped by years of learning to move carefully through a world that didn't stop for quiet people. Eleanor understood something then, with sudden sharpness. The story she thought had ended was still unfolding, and if there was any chance to understand it fully, she couldn't look away again. Not now. Eleanor Brooks didn't rush this time. After seeing Lillian again, she resisted the urge to act immediately. She had learned that sudden movement often closed doors before they ever opened. Instead, she began where she should have long ago, with listening. She reached out to people she trusted, not with accusations, not with demands, with questions. Old colleagues met her for coffee. A retired school counselor agreed to talk during a quiet afternoon. A clinic administrator pulled records that had long been archived and rarely revisited. Eleanor didn't frame the conversations around blame. She framed them around patterns. "Do you remember how often follow-ups quietly disappear?" she asked. There were pauses, frowns, slow nods. "I thought someone else was handling it," one person said. "I assumed no news was good news," another admitted. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. This wasn't about a single child or a single moment. It was about how responsibility thinned as it passed from one hand to another, until no one felt it fully. Eleanor wrote everything down, not as evidence, but as understanding. When Lillian finally agreed to meet, they chose a small diner near the river. It was the kind of place where no one rushed you, and the coffee was refilled without being asked. Lillian arrived early, sitting with her hands wrapped around a mug, eyes tracing the view outside. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said. Lillian nodded. "I wanted to hear what you had to say." "I'm not here as an official," Eleanor said carefully. "I'm here because I should have asked better questions a long time ago." Lillian listened without interrupting. "There were things I approved without really seeing them," Eleanor continued. "I trusted that silence meant stability. I was wrong." Lillian stirred her coffee slowly. "I don't think anyone meant for things to turn out the way they did." "I know," Eleanor said. "That doesn't change the impact." Lillian looked up then. "Why now?" Eleanor met her gaze. "Because pretending time fixed everything felt dishonest." The conversation stayed measured. Honest. No raised voices. No sudden forgiveness. Just clarity. Before they left, Eleanor said, "I want to make sure this doesn't keep happening. To anyone. Not quietly." Lillian considered that. "I don't want to be an example." "I wouldn't ask you to be," Eleanor replied. "Only to be heard if you choose." As Eleanor drove home, she felt something steady forming. Not hope exactly, but resolve. She wasn't gathering allies for a fight. She was gathering truth for something that had waited too long to be named. And once truth was assembled, she knew it didn't stay contained for long. The decision did not come all at once. It arrived in small moments between conversations. During quiet drives home, in the pauses where Eleanor Brooks realized there were still choices left to make. None of them were easy. All of them carried weight. The first cost was subtle. Eleanor requested a formal review of past procedures, not naming names, not pointing fingers, just asking that certain patterns be examined. The response was polite, cautious, and unmistakably distant. "Your reopening settled matters," one administrator warned. "We need to be careful," another said. "This could reflect poorly," someone else added. Eleanor understood what they meant. She was being advised to let the past remain quiet. Instead, she submitted the request anyway. The second cost followed quickly. Meetings were canceled. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations ended sooner than they used to. Eleanor felt the shift the way one feels a room grow colder without a window opening. She didn't complain. One evening, she met Lillian again at the diner by the river. The place was nearly empty, the sky outside already dark. "I want you to hear this from me," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "I've asked for a full review. It may lead to questions I can't control." Lillian looked at her carefully. "Does that affect you?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "It does." "Why do it?" "Then?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. She watched the surface of the coffee ripple slightly as a server passed by. "Because staying comfortable would be easier," she said finally. "And wrong." Lillian nodded once. "I don't need apologies," she said. "I just don't want silence again." "You won't get it from me," Eleanor replied. Days later, Eleanor was called into a meeting she hadn't requested. The tone was measured, professional, unmistakably final. "You've built a strong career," the director said, "but this path may change how people see your work." Eleanor met his gaze. "I'm aware." "You could step back," he offered. "Let this go." Eleanor thought of a broom leaning against a curb, a quiet child waiting without expectation, years passing without answers. "No," she said. "I won't." The sacrifice became clear then, not dramatic, not public, but real. Eleanor accepted that the reputation she had built might not survive intact, that her final years in uniform would be defined not by comfort, but by consequence. When she left the building, the evening air felt sharp and clean. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor breathed deeply. Later, she received a message from Lillian. "Thank you for not stopping," it read. Eleanor looked at the screen for a long moment. She knew the process ahead would be slow, uncertain, incomplete. But something essential had already changed. She had chosen truth over ease, presence over protection. And whatever the outcome, she understood now that some victories were measured not by what was gained, but by what one was willing to give up. The night before the review, Eleanor Brooks didn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the quiet sounds of her house, the ticking clock in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rush of a car passing on the main road. These were the kinds of sounds she had always found reassuring, proof that life moved forward. Steady and predictable. Tonight, they felt different. On the kitchen table lay a thin folder, not thick with accusations or dramatic evidence, just notes, dates, patterns, observations written in careful handwriting, the story of how something important had been missed, not once but slowly over time. Eleanor closed the folder and pushed it aside. She wasn't afraid of what would be said tomorrow. She was afraid of what couldn't be undone. Earlier that evening, she had met Lillian for a short walk near the river. The sky had been painted in soft colors, the water reflecting light in gentle ripples. "I won't be there tomorrow," Lillian said quietly as they walked. "I don't think I should be." "That's your choice," Eleanor replied. "And it's the right one." Lillian stopped near the railing and looked out across the water. "I don't need explanations anymore," she said. "I've made peace with some things." Eleanor nodded. "Peace doesn't mean forgetting." "No," Lillian agreed. "It just means not letting it decide everything." They stood together in silence. After a moment, Lillian asked, "Do you ever wish you hadn't noticed me that day?" Eleanor turned to her, surprised. "No," she said without hesitation. "I wish I had noticed sooner." Lillian smiled faintly. "That makes two of us." As they said goodbye, Lillian paused. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "thank you for staying, even when it was uncomfortable." Eleanor watched her walk away, her steps steady, unhurried. Now, alone in her house, Eleanor replayed those words. Tomorrow would bring questions. Consequences. Interpretations she couldn't control. She knew how institutions protected themselves. She knew how easily intentions could be reframed. But she also knew something else. This was no longer about fixing the past. It was about acknowledging it. Just before midnight, Eleanor stood and walked to the front door. She opened it and stepped outside. The street was empty, quiet under the glow of streetlights. Somewhere, a porch light flicked off. A window closed. Life continuing. Eleanor took a slow breath. For years, she had believed that doing her job well meant keeping things orderly, contained, resolved. Tonight, she understood that sometimes resolution meant letting things be seen, without knowing how they would be received. She closed the door and turned off the lights. Tomorrow, she would walk into that room without armor, without certainty, only with the truth, and that she knew was the point of no return. The room was quieter than Eleanor Brooks expected. No raised voices, no long table lined with faces turned stern. Just a handful of people, a recorder placed carefully in the center, and a stack of documents arranged as if order alone could keep emotions contained. Eleanor took her seat. She wasn't asked to swear anything. She wasn't warned. The chairperson simply nodded and said, "You asked for this review. Please begin." Eleanor opened her folder. She didn't start with conclusions. She started with moments. A postponed appointment. A follow-up marked pending. A note that said no concerns expressed. Individually, they sounded harmless, familiar. The kind of language everyone in the room had used at some point in their careers. None of these decisions were unreasonable on their own, Eleanor said. That's what made them dangerous. A few people shifted in their seats. She moved slowly, deliberately from one document to the next. Each page added context, not accusation. A pattern began to emerge, not sharp, not dramatic, but undeniable. Silence had been mistaken for stability. Compliance had been confused with wellness. Quiet had been read as strength. When Eleanor reached the final set of papers, she paused. "These approvals," she said, her voice steady, "include my signature." No one interrupted. "I trusted the process," she continued. "I trusted that if something was wrong, it would be made visible. I was wrong." A question came from the far end of the table. "Are you saying the system failed?" Eleanor shook her head. "I'm saying the system did exactly what it was designed to do. Move forward, efficiently, quietly." Another voice followed. "And the child?" Eleanor didn't answer immediately. "She adapted," she said finally. "She learned to make herself easy to overlook, and we let her." The words settled heavily in the room. There was no gasp, no dramatic reaction, just the slow recognition of something that could not be unseen. One of the administrators leaned forward. "These conditions you're describing, they developed over time." "Yes," Eleanor said. "That's why no one noticed." She closed the folder. "The moment that made me stop," she added, "wasn't a report. It wasn't a complaint. It was a small, human gesture. I knelt down to speak to a child and realized how long no one had been at her level." The recorder hummed softly. No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, the chairperson said, "This review will continue." Eleanor nodded. She had expected nothing more. As she left the building, the late afternoon light spilled across the steps outside. People passed her without recognition, heading toward their own destinations. Eleanor stood still for a moment, breathing in the air. The truth hadn't exploded. It had sunk, and she knew, without being told, that everything that came after would be shaped by what had finally been acknowledged. The confrontation wasn't a victory. It was an ending to silence, and the beginning of something that could no longer be ignored. The retirement notice was brief, a single page, a date, a quiet acknowledgement of years served. Eleanor Brooks signed it without ceremony, then placed the pen back where it belonged. There were no speeches, no gathering in the hallway, no final patrol. She left the building the same way she had entered so many times before, steady, unnoticed, carrying only what mattered. Outside, the city moved on. Traffic flowed. Conversations overlapped. Somewhere a child laughed. Life did not pause to mark endings, and Eleanor found comfort in that. It meant the world did not depend on grand conclusions to keep going. Weeks passed. Eleanor adjusted to mornings without urgency. She walked more, read slowly, learned how to sit with quiet that no longer demanded decisions. Some days she thought about the review and its consequences. Other days she didn't. The truth had been spoken. What others chose to do with it was no longer hers to carry. One afternoon, she found herself back on the street where it had all begun. The sidewalk was clean. Different houses, different faces. The place looked ordinary, almost forgettable. Eleanor stood there for a moment, hands in her coat pockets, remembering a broom leaned against a curb and a child who waited without expecting anything. "Chief," a voice began, then corrected itself. Then, "Eleanor." She turned. Lillian stood a few steps away, not the girl from before, not the young woman from the pharmacy. Someone settled into herself, carrying both history and distance with quiet balance. "I heard you retired," Lillian said. "I did," Eleanor replied. They walked together for a while, neither rushing. "I wanted to tell you something," Lillian said eventually. "I don't think my life would have been completely different. Not magically better, but—" She paused, choosing her words. "I live with more clarity now, about what was mine to carry and what wasn't." Eleanor nodded. "That matters." "Yes," Lillian said. "It does." They stopped at the corner, the same one where a decision had once been made without understanding its weight. "I don't forgive everything," Lillian added gently, "but I don't need to. Being seen was enough." Eleanor felt the truth of that settle inside her, calm and certain. They said goodbye without promises. As Eleanor walked home, she understood something she hadn't before. Transformation didn't mean fixing the past. It didn't mean erasing mistakes or turning pain into inspiration. It meant honesty. It meant recognition. It meant choosing to kneel when standing would be easier. And sometimes, quietly, without applause. It meant staying long enough for someone to know they were no longer invisible. That was all. And it was enough.